Okay, we're quite sure how this is going to work. So, hello, welcome back. So, we're entering into what should be, this actually should be labeled as part 5, Return of the Bearded Weirdos. So, let's take a step back and go and look back at the presidency of Rutherford Bertrand Hayes. Rutherford B. Hayes, remember, won the election of 1876 in a very controversial fashion through a sort of secret backroom agreement referred to as the Compromise of 1877. And as a result of this, he came in under a cloud of suspicion by both the Democrats and even his own Republican Party members. Really, given all of that, there wasn't a whole heck of a lot he was going to be able to do. And the sad thing is, he probably could have been a good president, but he was sort of put in a position where he was set up to do nothing. I don't want to say set up to fail. He was really set up to do nothing. He had not been the party's first choice for president, remember? And they made it abundantly clear that he really wasn't who they wanted. And to be fair to him, he kind of knew it and just said, I don't intend on running again. And they're like, good, because we don't intend on nominating you again. Now, when we look over the whole history of the presidency of Hayes, there is one area that is an immediate, utter, glaring failure. And really surprisingly, too, that is the failure in terms of civil rights. In an effort to restore control to the southern states and to sort of go back to the idea that the state governments were the ones who had priority, Hayes really backed off of, like, after the Civil War, running the South. And the downside of this is that with the South being in charge of its affairs again, it kind of went back to what it did before, which was repressing Black America. There was a very misguided effort on the part of Hayes and other Republicans to really think that by turning over control of the southern states to themselves again, returning control of the South back to the southern states, I should say, would somehow or another encourage Southerners to vote Republican. It failed miserably. Even the Southerners who probably would have voted Republican really couldn't go against the Ku Klux Klan. And as a result, it was an utter failure. The people who really, the people who were the real victims of this were the African Americans. He could not maintain civil rights and allow Southern states to run themselves. He didn't have the ability to do that. And as a result, you see a lot of the growth of the black codes and Jim Crow laws during that period of time. Now, let's look at one area that actually is a success here. So we go from a big failure to a success. The ending of the corruption of Grant's administration. Hayes instituted, at least in the executive branch, because he could only do it with that. The Congress and the courts would not go along with him on this. A concept called meritocracy. This is the idea. It comes from two root words here: merit, meaning to earn or be worthy of, and ocracy, which is government. A government of being worthy of or being earned. If you wanted a job in the executive branch, you had to actually pass a test and prove that you were qualified for it. This actually did not sit well with the Republicans who had gotten him his victory. They expected to be rewarded, and when he refused to reward them with government jobs, this really didn't sit well. Hayes spent much of his presidency working with this idea that in order to be given a government job, he had to be qualified to do the job you were asking for. Now, it is worthwhile noting here that Hayes would be referred to what is known as a teetotaler. And we have to be a little bit more specific. Hayes's wife, Lucy, was a member of the Women's Christian Temperance Movement. They were essentially all white evangelical Christian women. The same, by the way, women who primarily made up the Ku Klux Klan's Women Auxiliary. They believed that the root of all evil was alcohol. And Lucy, while Hayes himself had no problem with people who wanted to have alcohol, Lucy wanted nothing to do with it, so Hayes went along with her. And in large measure, thanks to her efforts, no alcohol was served at any executive functions. If you went to dinner at the White House, you didn't get wine or champagne or beer. You got like water or lemonade or something. Um, the goal of the temperance movement was to outlaw alcohol, period, because they felt that it was the source of all evil in society. I mean, even go back and think about like the comments that had been made in Samuel Gomper's "What the Working Man Wants." He talks about alcohol abuse, so I mean that was obviously a big problem. The underlying thing with the women's temperance movement, though, is not just the idea that alcohol is the root of the problems. There is a very strong anti-immigrant and, quite frankly, a religious bigotry issue involved here too. So the stereotype is that the Irish, the Germans, the Italians, these people all drank far too much. And the temperance movement really targeted those immigrant groups as being problems for society. Now, it's also kind of an interesting coincidence, if it is a coincidence, that the German, Irish, Italians, and Greeks who were coming to America at this time were primarily Catholic or Orthodox Christian, both of whom use alcohol in their religious ceremonies. So the evangelical Protestant temperance movement not only was an effort to sort of make society better, which is what progressivism tries by legislating better, but it was also the idea that they were really kind of making comments about immigrant groups and religious groups that they weren't personally fond of by going after what was viewed to be something acceptable and common and maybe even necessary in those segments. Now, business and money wise, this should come as no surprise. Hayes, remember we talked about this, favored the gold standard. Um, but there was the pesky issue of the greenbacks that were still in circulation. They had been in circulation since the Civil War, and because they were still floating around, many people had actually come to depend on them. And a large number of people, or at least a significant number of them, their savings were wrapped up in these things. And you couldn't exactly just, get rid of them because then suddenly you have a bunch of people who have nothing. And that wouldn't necessarily be good either. Um, so, what Hayes decided to do, which is exceptionally controversial, by the way, is he instituted something known as the buyback plan. Um, what this did was for a limited point in time or a limited amount of time, the government said that starting, at a certain date, greenbacks would no longer be eligible to be used. They were going to be phased out of circulation. But if you were willing to do it, you could come to a bank and they would actually let you cash your greenbacks in exchange for like real money. So if you want an analogy, it would be that it would be like sort of being told that for a limited amount of time, you could go and cash in monopoly money for real money. And obviously, people are going to kind of be in on that. And that's what they did. Um, they brought their cash in. They got real money for the greenbacks. It succeeded in pulling the greenbacks out of circulation. The downside is it did cause some financial issues, but eventually the economy was able to work it out and you got rid of the worthless paper money and went back to a fully gold standard. Now, Hayes was also very pro-business. Remember, he's the guy who sent the troops in the B&O railroad strike. Now, the irony of this is that he was actually very sympathetic with labor. He agreed with them on a lot of the points they were striking about. It was not fair that private companies and banks and the government had used money unwisely. And as a result, the businesses were failing, and the businesses were basically punishing their employees by lowering wages and raising working hours to compensate for this. Similarly, it was not fair that new immigrants to America who weren't even full citizens yet were willing to take jobs at half the pay that would otherwise have been occupied by Americans. But that having been said, he's was really of the opinion that you just can't go nutso and cause disruptions to major portions of society because of your displeasure. This perception, though, that his pro-business view, his view that business was really that important, led labor to believe that Republicans were all about big business, and that this is why labor generally sided with the Democrats, which is still a trend that has continued up through today. Now, obviously, Hayes does not run for re-election. In the election of 1800 or 1880, you have Republican James Garfield versus Democrat Winfield Scott Hancock, both of whom are former Civil War generals. Very similar ideas, very similar standpoints with stuff. Um, the only reason, frankly, that Hancock was not a Republican is that he felt that the Republicans were abusing the power of the government and had been doing so since Reconstruction, and that the states needed to get back into running themselves. Um, Garfield wins by less than 2,000 votes. So to break that down, that's like about 65 votes per state. That's really a small margin. Now, he's only president for about 6 months, but in that short 6 months, he does quite a bit. He sort of reestablishes the fact that the presidency is kind of an important thing. Um, Grant didn't believe that it was. Hayes really couldn't do anything because of his circumstances. Garfield didn't have those issues, and he really went gusto back into, no, I'm the president, darn it, I'm going to do this. He also began looking at fixing the Navy. We'll talk about this a little bit more later, but Garfield recognized that the United States was in a severe military deficit and needed to modernize itself. He encouraged free trade, especially international free trade amongst other countries, and he really fought again for civil rights, whereas Hayes was more concerned with trying to grow support in the South. Garfield just like, nope, we're not going to win. We're really going to do what we can to help out Black America. Garfield is killed by a man named Charles Guiteau, who shot him at a railroad station in Baltimore, Maryland, while waiting for a train. There was no Secret Service at the time, by the way. Garfield did have bodyguards, one of whom was the son of Abraham Lincoln. The kid's voodoo, man. His dad got shot. Garfield gets shot. 20 years later, President William McKinley, whose bodyguard is also the son of Abraham Lincoln, gets shot. No, man, you put that Lincoln kid in front of me, I'm dead. No, we're not doing that. But a guy named Charles Guiteau. Charles Guiteau believed that he should have been made ambassador to France because he had gotten people to vote for Garfield. And as a loyal supporter of Garfield and somebody who got him votes, he should be given the ambassadorship to France. Why France? Because Guiteau's a French name, so he figured it would fit and be appropriate. Guiteau didn't speak French. I don't know how much he actually knew about France. I don't even know if he knew where France was on a map. But he walked up to Garfield, shot him at the train station. The irony of this is that Garfield was more or less okay. They took him to the hospital, the Naval Hospital in Annapolis, where the doctors operated on him with unclean and unwashed hands and unsterilized surgical instruments. Garfield died about 6 weeks later of necrotic gangrene he contracted in the hospital because of unclean utensils. Let's see a picture here of Garfield. So yeah, there he is in all of his resplendent glory. That's him in 1878, 100 years later, kind of dumpy looking. 84 starting to firm up a little bit, probably got an exercise program. 88 definitely much bigger. 92 smaller and looking emo. 96 back happy with himself again. And by 2000 he was the fat lovable little tabby we knew. Now I put this up here half joking. Garfield the cat is actually named after James Garfield. Jim Davis, the creator of Garfield, is related to James Garfield, and there was always a tradition of having the name Garfield somewhere within the family as a name. So Jim Davis gave it to the cartoon cat. Garfield is followed up by Chester Arthur, who does not have the epic beard, but he's got his own epic facial hair. Notice that. It's unibrow, uniburns. Okay. So here's the thing with Chester Arthur. Arthur was roundedly disliked and mistrusted by both Republicans and Democrats. So the question is, well, how did he get the job that he did? Well, first of all, it's the vice presidency. We ain't talking about anything super important here. No offense. Secondly, if you were to look up the definition of cronyism in a dictionary, there would be a picture of Chester Arthur there. Every job that Arthur had ever had in politics, he had because he was related to somebody or knew somebody or somebody owed him a favor. He really had no marketable skills. In fact, the great irony of this is that Chester Arthur had been fired by Rutherford B. Hayes for being unqualified for the executive job that he had during Hayes' administration. And then 3 years later, Arthur's the president. So keeping all this in mind, Arthur was a political crony. That's what he was all about. Ironically enough, he proves to be a very effective president. One of the very first things he did was to use the death of Garfield to leverage the government to actually approve civil service reform across the board. Civil service is a fancy way of saying government jobs. And what he did was he came in and spoke to Congress, and he's basically like, our beloved President Garfield is dead. Why? Because all of you refused to pass this civil service law. Because if you had, Charles Guiteau would not have thought he earned or deserved a job, and President Garfield would still be alive today. His blood is basically on your hands. So sign the bill, please. Thanks. It worked. The Congress passed through a bill saying that all the branches of government, now you had to be qualified to get a job in, which is remember what Hayes had done originally in the executive branch. The process that Garfield had begun with modernizing the Navy, Arthur really is able to start doing because he has a budget surplus, which means that after the government pays its bills, there's money left over. Well, rather than spend it on something stupid, which he knew the government would do, he spent it on modernizing the Navy. The Navy was still pretty much the same ship since the Civil War, and they were kind of dumpy and frumpy. As we'll talk about a little bit later, this is a never-ending bone of contention, if you will. Arthur also changed some issues regarding immigration, specifically restricting immigration from China and also changing who we would let in the country, specifically that the United States was not open to people of physical or mental handicaps if those people had nobody to care for them or they were unable to care for themselves. This was just to sort of prevent people from bringing over it was essentially to stop people from coming over here who had no family to take care of them. Because the whole thing was that it was not the government's job to take care of people. It was family's job. So if you wanted to come to America and you were physically or mentally crippled, you had better have family here, otherwise you weren't going to be allowed in. Arthur does not seek re-election because he had kidney failure, and he felt that it would be disrespectful and disingenuous to the country for him to take a job he might not be able to fulfill. So he just basically stepped aside. The best thing that can be said for Chester Arthur is that he came in completely unliked and mistrusted. He left office being respected by both parties because of his integrity and how hard he worked. So good for Chuck. Let's go to the next one here. The election of 1884, and boy, is this a flaming bucket of whack. So again, the two parties nominate very similar candidates. For the Republicans, you have the unfortunately named James G. Blaine of the state of Maine. And for the Democrats, it's New York Governor Grover Cleveland. He's the governor of New York, but his name is Cleveland. That throws me every time. The real difference between Blaine and Cleveland is their approach to foreign policy. Well, excuse me. Foreign policy, aside from being an epic Megadeth song off their Grammy-winning album Dystopia, foreign policy is how you deal with other countries. Blaine was of the opinion, and the Republicans were too, that the U.S. should get more involved with foreign countries, and we should be really active in what they're doing. Cleveland was more of the opinion that no, we don't need to be doing that. We really need to stay and mind our own business and affairs, and we'll trade with other people, but we really don't want to be involved with them. What really does start to show here, though, is a growing split, particularly in the Democratic Party versus progressive and conservative ideas. Cleveland is definitely a conservative Democrat. He is in favor of the gold standard. He is all about free trade. He is all about limited government. And he's all about the need for big business. Blaine is somebody who has a history of cronyism. But Blaine's attitude regarding the need for the U.S. to be more active in other countries' business and affairs really does reflect a growing progressive strain in the Democratic Party. And the Democrats are starting to drift sort of this idea that they want to be more active and spread their ideas around the world. Whereas the conservatives are like, nope, we're just going to mind our own business. During the election, what started out, I guess, more or less okay, degenerated rather quickly. The Democrats came up with a catchy little jingle that they would sing at campaign rallies. Blaine, James G. Blaine, Continental Liar from the state of Maine, to sort of really pin the fact that Blaine himself was a crony. He had a history of government job appointments to people who were unqualified for them, and people who just earned them because they had done favors for him or gotten him votes or were related to somebody that he owed a favor to, etc. The Democrats hammered this. For their part, the Republicans did something a little weird. So, Grover Cleveland was the youngest man at the time ever to run for president. I think he was only 48. Now, again, keeping in mind that standards of physical attraction and stuff are different. For his time, he was considered to be exceptionally handsome. He was the governor of the most powerful state in the country, and he was very well off. Yet he was single. Why is that? Why should any such eligible man be single? Because the bachelor life suited him because he was single looking to mingle, baby. Yeah, because that's what he wants to do. He just wants to go around the country having various and sundry relationships with women without ever having to be tied down to marriage. Cleveland himself had stated at one point that the worst part about being governor of New York was the number of women who kept trying to set him up with their daughters. It was a constant stream of them. But the Republicans sort of pushed this narrative that Cleveland had been nefariously involved with various women throughout New York, and as president, he would do it with various women throughout the country. They even went so far as to pull out some random whack job woman from Cincinnati who claimed that Cleveland was her baby daddy and pulled out some kid that she said was his. Nothing could be proven because they didn't have any DNA testing or whatever else, but it was a really strange thing. In the end, Cleveland wins by less than 1% of the vote. The most interesting thing about the election is that what ends up being the deciding factor are the states of Missouri, Indiana, Kentucky, and Maryland, all of whom over the past three elections have switched back and forth between Republican and Democrat, and they have always voted for the winning candidate. These states become known as swing states because they swing their vote back and forth between the parties, and their votes swing the election towards one candidate or the other. Okay, that's it for this episode. Peace and love.